Hello everyone and welcome to ClimaTalk's third COP26 live discussion session. Today we're going to be focusing on the developments and disappointments at COP26 surrounding the inclusion of youth and Indigenous communities. I'm Amy Wilson and I lead the COP26 team at ClimaTalk. The ClimaTalk is a youth-led non-profit organisation that aims to demystify climate policy and amplify young people's voices. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by two of my fellow ClimaTalk colleagues, Virginia and Chiara. Chiara has been tracking youth inclusion at COP26, and I'm pleased to say she is there still at COP26 in Glasgow. So a huge welcome, Chiara. And Virginia has been tracking the involvement and exclusion of Indigenous communities at COP. So a huge welcome to you as well. We are going to split the session into two components. The first 20 minutes will be focusing on the youth inclusion at COP26, and the latter 20 minutes will be on Indigenous communities and rights. If you have any questions during the event, please put them on whatever social media platform you are watching on, and we will be sure to take those to our panelists. So first of all, I would like to move on to our speakers. I'm really pleased to say we are joined today by Priyank, who is an international lawyer from India and has been attending COP26 as a delegate for the Indian Youth Climate Network and the Council of Energy, Environment and Water. He is a special assistant to the CEO at the Council of Energy, Environment and Water, and one of Asia's leading climate policy think, which is one of Asia's leading climate policy think tanks. Very much grateful to have you here, Priyank, and I look forward to discussing more with you. But is there any additional introductions you would like to mention for yourself?
Hello, thank you, Amy. Very pleased to be here. This is all good. Looking forward to the discussion and very happy to be in this august company of youth advocates and delegates.
Great. We are also hoping to be joined by Alison Cole a little later in the discussions for the Indigenous communities section of the live session. She is a principal Indigenous lawyer who looks at human rights and is an environmental consultant at Opinio Native. Alison is a former UN war crimes investigator who now works to alleviate Indigenous voices. Opinio Native is a Maori-owned consultancy based in Tāmaki Makaurau, Auckland, which looks to promote Indigenous knowledge and practices as the go-to for solving future issues. Virginia, I was wondering if you maybe like to add a few additional points for Alison as she cannot be here right now.
Yes, absolutely. I'd be so thrilled to get to meet her because she is an incredible human rights lawyer, and as a representative of the South Taranaki, Nuarahine, Ngati and Taki Wanui people, it would be an honor for us to have an Indigenous speaker on our panel who can convey actual Indigenous perspectives on the issues we're talking about and therefore provide a proper insight into what's going on at COP.
Yeah, we have our fingers crossed. She is currently in some negotiations on Article 6, so we're hoping she might be able to nip out and join us. So we will move on to youth to begin with. And Chiara has kindly put together the bullet points on the slide. So Chiara, I was wondering if you could start off by just maybe expanding on your bullet points and explain a little bit more about why you pulled these bullet points out as the key points to youth inclusion.
Thank you very much, Amy. I'm really happy to have this live discussion on youth empowerment. Yesterday, as we know, COP26 focused on youth empowerment and public engagement. So these bullet points are basically the main outcomes of yesterday's focus on youth. So the first one, the president of COP26, Alok Sharma, urged ministers to consider youth priorities in COP negotiations and national climate action. This is a big commitment by Alok Sharma and also a very important one. But then the bigger commitment, let's say, by countries participating in COP26 was the pledge made by 23 countries to make national climate education at the center of their strategies, and also including net zero schools and putting climate at the heart of national curriculum. And then other important points were yesterday we had the pleasure to see the representative of COP26, which is the youth equivalent of COP26, the lead in the global youth statements to high-level actors such as Patricia Espinosa, the president Alok Sharma, and Nicola Sturgeon, the Prime Minister of Scotland. And then another important pledge by Italy, who hosted the Youth for Climate event back in Milan a few weeks ago. Italy pledged to continue hosting or just trying to work with the UNFCCC to host the Youth for Climate event in the coming years, every year before COP. And this event will now be called Youth for Climate Forever. So this was just a brief summary of the points, but I can say some more about these points, especially because this is the side of, let's say, what politicians and policymakers said. But then by attending the different events, we also got the side of the young people, and we really understood or discovered whether their voices were really being heard or not. So for instance, Alok Sharma urged the ministers to consider youth priorities, and the the global youth statements were delivered to them. And the request by young people was especially to consider the paragraph drafted by UNGO. They really wanted to see this paragraph included in the outcome of COP26. And Alok Sharma, as well as Patricia Espinosa, said they will make their best to tell negotiators so. But then one meeting in the afternoon, a young guy, also a representative of UNGO, said that yesterday was the last day of the ACE negotiations. And in those negotiations, the UNGO paragraph was not listed in the agenda. And if it's not listed in the agenda, then it means that it won't be discussed. And if it's not discussed, then it means that it can be accepted and agreed upon. So he just highlighted the fact that probably, 99% of probability, the UNGO paragraph won't be included in the final outcome of COP26. For instance, the 23 countries pledged to include net zero schools and also improve the climate education in the curriculum. But the Italian Minister of Education also said that it's not enough to include 1 hour of climate education in schools. We should reform the whole school system to make it climate resilient and to fight climate change as a whole. More comprehensively. And last but not least, Italy announced that the Youth for Climate event will continue every year, but rightfully so. Some young people said to the Italian minister, Cingolani, who hosted the event, that we now have many spaces where people can gather, like also COP26, but what young people really need now is to get a chance to be at the negotiation table. Probably Priyank will say more about this later, but young people are not included in the delegation teams of the different countries, with an exception of Panama, which has the youngest delegation ever. Everyone is under 27 years old. So that's amazing, and that's really sets the example for the other countries. But just to finish on this, young people need to be included in the negotiation, in the delegation, team so they can participate actively in the negotiation table, because as of now at COP26, most of them were observers, and it was really difficult for them to get inside even in the negotiation events. And one suggestion that was made to Cingolani on the Youth for Climate event was, like someone said, it was nice to see the different ministers giving speeches, but what we want is just to talk with them and create a dialogue with them and not just heard their speeches. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a really great summary and a lot of hope for what has happened with the youth. It's nice to hear that some of the events that we at Climate Talk have followed, such as COP16 and Youth for Climate, actually have been brought to the table at COP26, because I think that was one of the biggest fears, that you know, everything they worked really hard for at those events wouldn't be heard. So it's really great that that's come through. Praying, maybe you could expand a little bit more on, do you think this is satisfactory? Is this enough youth inclusion? Do we have a long way to go? Is this just the start?
Thank you, Amy, for the question. And also Chiara for laying down the floor so well with all of the ideas and thoughts that have been perhaps said.
Sorry, Prayang, we can't hear you too well. It might be just, that's a bit better. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So I was saying that thank you, Chiara, for laying down the floor with telling us what all has happened so far. And I would say on the question of if this is satisfactory or not, I think we just have to look at the anger that protesters have outside. They are not just protesting because activism is cool, but also because they have real expectations for change. And those expectations are time bound. It is the future generations that are going to be affected by climate change, and they want to see some real action come out. Now, on that front, it could be coal decommissioning, it could be climate finance, it could be loss and damage, but unless they see the negotiators making progress and countries displaying confidence that things are moving forward, it won't. On the issue of inclusion, people have said this COP has been very difficult in terms of inclusion. COVID norms have been considered as a way or a barrier for people to participate effectively. But I also feel that for different constituencies, youth, women, gender, elsewhere, we need champions from the inside. There's a lot of pressure that we can create from the outside, which brings media highlight and puts the bar on governments that this is what you have to do. But until and unless we have champions from the inside, from the governments, from the negotiators, who are able to understand, who are formerly youth representatives, and they're able to understand, okay, we need to talk to all stakeholders, we will not come out of a solution. Younger constituency, all others are meeting every day, effectively discussing strategies, and they would like to have a seat at the table. But the reality is that climate change discussions are very much governed by economics, and until and unless you have a leverage, right, you cannot introduce yourself in the conversation. So while the UNFCCC framework does not recognize such stakeholders to be parties, right, we are still observers, and it is very difficult to include ourselves ministers because of the pressure that is there. I'm in no way advocating for the status quo, but I'm suggesting that the youth movement and the activists as a whole have to pursue different strategies, and it is commendable what they have done to reach this far. And it is not satisfactory, but we need to, as much as we are creating push factors, we need some pull from within the system as well to be able to be included. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think that's a really good point, and I think the champion idea is really important for feedback loops, so that people that aren't at COP necessarily or can't listen all day can understand what's going on, and the information actually gets out of COP for all the young people that are interested and currently involved in the space. So I totally agree. So in the last week or so, there's been a lot of coverage of Greta that we see on a daily basis. Do you feel like the youth activists from the global south are getting as much as a feature and are being considered as much as Greta, for example? Praying, do you want to go?
Sure. I think credit to Greta for what she's done in the past 5-6 years by building the movement in a way, but I think she would also agree that this movement is not a one-face movement. You need champions and representatives from across. And past few years, of course, from India, from the global south, I do see young people coming out as advocates for youth inclusion, climate action. But we definitely need more champions. The point is that today Greta is not only harboring the responsibility, but also the liability of the youth movement, that she's also a target for a lot of political backlash that she receives. So having more people will only strengthen the youth movement, more voices and more faces that can be done. And in that context, I would also like to add, in addition to Panama, even Nepal has sent a completely youth delegation, to the COP. So some countries are looking at that challenge, but those are the smaller countries who do not have that kind of a footprint. So, and I also want to just make the point that, as much as we talk about what needs to be done at the COP and what is happening at the COP, real action happens at the till and unless youth movements are congregating themselves on the ground and running campaigns, right, to actually influence lifestyle change and behavior choices, consumerism at the ground level. These platforms are bright and shiny for everybody, but they will not yield results. And it's a groundwork that will bring you up, and perhaps will also yield more political will, as in your country, to look at youth as a serious stakeholder. So on your question, yes, we need more representatives from all communities, all countries, socio-economic stratas, and we need to create more focus on what the youth is saying, and perhaps build capacity for them to engage with negotiators and technical people and on a level playing knowledge field.
Absolutely. I think the education and the training front is really important. And I think that was what was so nice to see at COI, that there was an element of training for young people. Chiara, maybe you could expand on the educational point you made earlier. We've got 23 countries now pledging on the educational front. Can you just expand on what that actually involves, and what stages of school, for example?
Yes, thank you, Amy. So the 23 countries who made these pledges, they included primary schools, well, from actually kindergarten, primary schools, and then secondary schools up to the universities. So in that sense, they covered all ages of young generations. And then they also said that they would like to basically improve the infrastructures of their schools to make them climate resilient, especially in developed and least developed countries. But one point that was raised by young people themselves yesterday was that all these pledges, countries want to achieve achieve these pledges by 2030, by 2040, by 2050. And some young people said, well, this is not about reducing CO2 emissions or delivering climate finance. These are, to their eyes, these pledges were more easier to implement. And so they said, not only it might be easier, but it's also important to do this now. And so they asked these ministers to achieve these goals by the coming years, so within the short term rather than in the long term.
That's great to hear, and obviously the quicker that we get implementation of climate education in schools is important. So Praying, I wonder if you can talk about the cross-cutting of youth and how in discussions in maybe like gender, health, such as mental health, transparency, how youth features in those, how the movements on the ground that we've discussed can help those negotiations.
So the two levels of it, of course, on issues like mental health, gender, public health issues, youth is a central player, and those are issues that have affected the consequences severely. There are two level fields on this I would like to talk about. The first spectrum is, how the movement as a consequence of youth understands these issues affecting themselves and organizes themselves to make sure that their voices are heard, right? And that will mean being part of policy planning processes when a city is talking about urban resilience. This will talk about having a look at divestment of universities. It will look at things like what role is youth playing in the governance and the planning and the organizing of the regular city life. Because let us agree that the change comes from bottom. At the COP, we can only talk about high-level things, just like Chiara mentioned. These are high-level words that you are pledging for net zero. So to do that, mental health, public health, very important. Right now, climate crisis is not just a crisis for the planet. It's a severe problem that is endangering human survival and well-being, as the IPCC report has said, and it has been caused by anthropogenic emissions. So it is us who've caused this. And now, this could be an intergenerational fight. It could be a fight between different communities. It could be a fight between countries or socio-economic strata that, okay, that the carbon budget has been gone. But the fact remains that we need that sensibility within governments to include all stakeholders while they are creating plans, while they are implementing plans. You cannot see and limit youth movements to protesters because that energy that they have is also going into solutions where they're coming up with technocratic solutions in agriculture, AI, elsewhere. But that energy needs to be utilized effectively. And until and unless governments have the sensibility to include youth as an important stakeholder at the basic national level planning, right, of things, you will not have a much impact at avenues like the COP because negotiations are technical. Even observer organizations who work, adults who are working on this issue for the longest time, are not able to access because it has strong limitations only for negotiators. So sensibility at the national level will only influence some international outlook to include youth. But also, I would say, just like every country has a Ministry of Youth and Gender, right? India has one. We need to standardize these ministries. We need to accelerate engagement of youth, and maybe the youth movement also needs to come out with more ideas and solutions and start implementing them and take the agency from governments. I'm not at all saying that what has been done so far is not enough, but because we demand more action, we cannot wait for governments to act. But then we also ourselves cannot close coal power plants. We need to educate communities to act. So I think we need to pick up the strategy that will yield maximum results and hope that the champions within government will include us in their discussions. So again, on negotiations, to include them effectively, constituencies, Yango and others are doing great work. But I would rather focus on the impact that they can bring on the ground rather than in Glasgow, because this is more or less a carnival where everybody is doing the side event. And we have speakers speaking around, and the real discussions are only happening in a limited corridor with people not allowed.
Great, and I think we are really starting to see that. I know I've seen a wealth of youth organizations start up recently and start to formulate ideas and solutions and start putting that to their governments, which is really encouraging to see. So we're going to round off the youth section now. So it'd be great if both of you could sort of answer, like, have young voices been heard at COP, and what do you expect to see maybe in the last week in terms of youth? So Chiara, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So this is a big question, and first of all, young people are not here at COP26. There is a very small minority of them, and so to be heard, they first need to be here. And then also, although it seemed like they politicians and policymakers and high-level actors heard young voices by receiving their manifestos and their proposals, still young people are not present in the negotiations table. And as said earlier, their proposals and their demands will probably not be included in the outcome of COP26. But to answer also the question, what do you expect? Well, I expect that paragraph to still be included in some way or another. And also for other negotiations on other aspects like mitigation and adaptation, to also include the respect of young people's rights, women's rights, indigenous communities' rights, and also leverage those climate education pledges of the countries.
Great. I hold out hope that we will see that, Chiara. Brian, would you like to add anything?
I would just say that the presidency has organized events, for young people, certain champions to speak and share their story and highlight the use and the value of having youth as part of the discussions. But I echo the sentiment that Chiara has said that while we are here outside the COP venue and while we are present inside, they may scream the loudest with just on people. And that frustration is also being felt by indigenous communities who actually take care of 80% of Earth's biodiversity, despite managing just 20% of them. So there is that, the voices are falling on deaf ears. You could say that, but then until unless we have the negotiators on the same table or the same event, we will not be able to understand the challenges from their side as to what is stopping this easy flow of communication and relationship building on both sides.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much for both joining today. I know you've both got a busy schedule ahead still for COP, so we'll let you shoot off now. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll move now on to Virginia, who is going to discuss with me about Indigenous people. It doesn't look like Alison has joined us just yet. We will hold out that she might be able to pop out a little bit, but we will start with the Indigenous communities section of today's live session. So I guess a good place to start was, what were your expectations going into COP26 for the inclusion of Indigenous people, Virginia?
So I think a thing that's worth mentioning right from the start is that Boris Johnson, Alok Sharma, and the heads of the UNFCCC did make big statements before COP about how inclusive it would be. This clashed even already months ago with the expectations of Indigenous peoples and minority groups, and more generally with the vision of people from the Global South. In fact, combining COVID-19 with visa restrictions, with the extreme high cost of traveling to COP, as we've seen ourselves by sending a delegation as well, it is extremely expensive. Most states that are represented by Indigenous communities or that are the forefront of climate suffering, say low-lying coastal communities, etc., do not have the money to send delegations to COP. So although there is finance dedicated to providing them with these means, it is not enough. So looking at that, plus the situation with COVID, plus visas, plus lack of vaccines, which was also a big debate surrounding COP as to whether they would only let in vaccinated delegates or not, meant that the expectations as to how inclusive COP would be in practice, despite the big statements about its inclusivity, were very pessimistic from the beginning. In fact, large numbers of Indigenous communities and groups from the Global South actually asked for COP to be postponed again, which there was large debates last year over this happening. And although I think most people are happy COP has actually taken place, many were asking for it to be postponed again because they were saying it's not fair to hold a COP in which people cannot actually participate. And I think there's some valid claims to that, particularly if we look at how even Chiara was mentioning earlier, and we saw from our own delegation talking yesterday, there's significant restrictions as to the number of people can access debate rooms because of COVID-19. So, and despite the fact that there have been obviously digital systems to permit people to participate, our group yesterday was saying there have been significant issues in how they've worked in practice. So the visions as to how it would be from the beginning were quite negative, if that answers your question.
Yeah, and I guess that is the great shame that we keep seeing across social media, the lack of access into some of these rooms. So it's great to touch on that again and highlight that hopefully they might be trying to resolve that moving forward. So I guess another really important question is, why is it so vital that Indigenous communities are in the negotiation halls?
Well, for a series of reasons. First of all, they are at the forefront of the climate crisis. They are the most impacted by already the effects of climate change now. They will be the most impacted by climate change in the future. In fact, the areas where we can already see, say, sea level rise are low-lying Pacific coastal areas, which are inhabited by Indigenous communities. We can look at the Amazon in Brazil. The people who are being displaced the most and who are seeing their livelihoods undermined by deforestation, etc., are Indigenous communities. Additionally, Indigenous communities represent at least half of human rights defenders that work on environmental issues, and at least half of the ones killed for fighting for their human rights. And there's been, I think, 227 cases reported so far this year of people killed for environmental human rights defending. half of these were Indigenous people. So they are the people who suffer the most, but they are also the people who can provide the biggest solutions to climate change. In fact, in things such as Indigenous food systems, we find the most sustainable ways of coexisting with our environment. Their traditions are those that preserve the ecosystems they live in. It's their knowledge that understands the planet we live in and how we can rebuild society in a way that allows us and our environment to coexist properly together. So they are not only the victims, but they are also a big part of the solution. They have the means. We can only learn from what they know. And unfortunately, I think there's a lot of work to be done on recognizing this. So far, there's a lot of words about Indigenous knowledge and how it's so important for Indigenous people to be included in debates on the climate crisis, but not as much has been done in practice. So yes, they are the biggest victims, but they're also a key part of the solution to combating the climate crisis.
So with that background, have the negotiations included Indigenous people? Like, how successful has getting Indigenous people to COP been, and what sort of like are the challenges for that to be possible?
I would start with say quite unsuccessful. In fact, although COP did start with the follow-up meeting of the facilitative working group on Indigenous peoples and local communities, which was created during the Katowice COP in 2018. And so going back to what Chiara was saying earlier, represented a big step in creating a forum for Indigenous people to talk, like an official UNFCCC forum. Unfortunately, there's been a bit of a divide between the creation of such a forum and the actual inclusion of Indigenous peoples in the COP negotiations. In fact, not only, as you mentioned, they've been left out of a significant number of pavilions and rooms during the panel debates, but they have been stopped from coming to COP due to visas, lack of accessibility of paperwork, etc. And I believe only 4 people from civil society and Indigenous communities in total, out of thousands that applied, were actually allowed into the negotiation room the other day, which is considered such a severe challenge that the 2 UN Special Rapporteurs, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, which is David Boyd, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Hazardous Substances and Human Rights, wrote to Alok Sharma to complain that COP26 is completely not inclusive, and definitely what they claimed before, because it is not allowing Indigenous peoples, minority groups, and children real access to any of the negotiations taking place. And so they signed this letter 2 days ago calling for immediate change to be made, for people to be let into the rooms, for money to be given to allow people to come even the last minute. But I don't think much changed in the past 2 days since this significant letter was sent to complain. And the fact that 2 UN Special Rapporteurs intervened criticizing another UN institution is also a significant step, that they deliberately wrote on the paper, it is not inclusive. But not much has happened. And in this regard, I don't think much is going to change from now onwards. I think there will be potentially more inclusion of Indigenous peoples on debates surrounding gender, for instance, mitigation and adaptation measures, or nature conservation. But aside from that, I think the space they're given to express their opinion is very much limited to side events and to civil society-led panels. I followed quite a few, all extremely interesting, talking about Indigenous knowledge, about Indigenous-based solutions, adaptation and mitigation solutions to climate change. But there's a clear divide between what the Indigenous community is allowed to do amongst themselves and what they're allowed to do with state leaders, which is close to zero. Progress was made recently, this September, in a slightly different setting in the International Union for Conservation of Nature in Marseille, where for the first time they gave Indigenous peoples voting rights on the actual final document. So if something like this were to happen at COP, it would be a significant step. I do not see it coming just yet. And it was quite important already that states such as Canada gave Indigenous peoples passes as their own state delegates even though they are not government representatives, they recognize that Canada is formed not only by Trudeau's clique of representatives, but also by the Indigenous First Nations of Canada. But it's only one out of 190 plus states that are at COP that did this. So there's a long way to go. And as of yet, they're not included. Their rights for free, prior, informed consent are not respected either. In fact, which is a right recognized in the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples. We'd hoped that more would be said on this at COP. As of yet, we couldn't see anything in this regard. So there's a long way to go. And regarding Indigenous inclusion, I think more than mentioning their names in the opening statement, than mentioning their names in the large deforestation pledge they made for 2030, or in the Forest Tenure Joint Donor Statement, again, it's a question of how much they'll be included in practice and how much their names are just listed as part of the flowery statement on climate change.
So I guess point there just to clarify for people that are unaware watching this. We obviously have the parties to the UNFCCC, and Indigenous people are not listed within that. Can you maybe expand on why and how you think we could include them going forward?
I mean, unfortunately, it's the same as most UN institutions and international organizations. It's a system which recognizes the existence of states, not of minority groups, and not of the private sector either, which in the context of climate change is also a significant challenge. We hold states accountable. We are yet to design a system that can hold non-state actors accountable, but also that can give non-state actors a voice. And although obviously something like COP is a significant step forward compared to other international mechanisms we have, because it allows the pavilions for civil society, it gives civil society at least observer status. We need to move from the observer status to the voting status, as Chiara was talking about with the youth. They need to be allowed to sit at the negotiating table and express an opinion that is treated at the same level. And this, at least in the case of Indigenous peoples, would be even just forcing states who have Indigenous communities to allow some of their representatives to be Indigenous peoples would be a step forward, as Canada's done. But I don't see that happening anytime soon, particularly for states such as Brazil and even Indonesia, who voted both in favor of the deforestation pledge, but who are already backtracking because they fear that it will be so impactful to their economy. So I do not see these kinds of states, or the United States with their Indigenous communities, swapping some of their state delegates for Indigenous peoples who will obviously vote for Indigenous rights and Indigenous priorities, not their economic priorities as a state at the negotiating table.
Thanks for that clarification point. And yeah, they're going to have to think of a different way, like the United States that you say, to include several different groups. So maybe we can move on to your bullet points that you pulled out on reviewing Indigenous inclusion. And the first one, maybe the joint statement, maybe just expand on what that was and how that came about.
So a couple of days ago, I think on the 2nd of November, a group of states, including the UK, Germany, etc., signed what they referred to as the Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities Forest Tenure Joint Donor Statement for the advancing of support of Indigenous peoples and local communities' tenure rights and their forest guardianship. As part of this pledge, they basically promised $1.7 billion to advance Indigenous tenureship as part of the mechanism they're devising now following the deforestation pledge by 2030 that they signed the other day. However, although this is a significant step forward, because one of the biggest challenges that Indigenous communities face in the context of climate change as well is a lack of financing given to specific Indigenous projects. And I believe they only receive 1% of climate finance and of financing for climate mitigation solutions, which is a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of what is actually necessary, particularly considering that they are the biggest solution in a lot of contexts, such as deforestation, to our problems. However, so this pledge is particularly important because it will give them $1.7 billion over the next 4 years. However, many Indigenous communities have actually criticized the pledge, saying that although it is a significant step forward, it is not enough for a series of reasons. Firstly, it is unclear, although the actual pledge says the money is supposed to go directly to Indigenous peoples, it is very unclear how this will happen in practice. And from past experience, they know it is very unlikely that this will happen in practice. It is more likely to go to state officials or to corporations who will be in charge of these so-called nature-based solutions that will link to these projects, and therefore is unlikely to actually make any steps in advancing Indigenous land tenure, which, for those who don't know, is key to climate solutions. It's mentioned in the IPCC documents as well, because guaranteeing Indigenous land ownership guarantees their control over their lands and therefore stops states and corporations from cutting down trees, from extracting fossil fuels, etc. The second reason they've criticized it is because, although, again, this pledge mentions things such as Indigenous knowledge and nature-based solutions, as well as the persecution of human rights defenders, it doesn't actually hold any commitment in that regard. The only thing it does say is that it will give $1.7 billion for Indigenous land tenure processes, which is a very vague description for what is going to happen in practice. And therefore, although the pledge itself is a huge step because it recognizes that more money needs to go towards Indigenous communities and towards Indigenous-led projects, it should not be seen actually as a guaranteeing of a nature-based solution or even of a community-based project, because it is more likely that the money will not go straight to Indigenous communities. And it is also, as of yet, unclear exactly where it will come from. It's a significant pledge financially, but it is not nearly enough. And we will have to wait and see if it actually materializes and how this happens.
Great. I guess that's a COP27 evaluation point to see if we have any movement or mechanisms forming on how that will come about. So the other document that I guess is important is the deforestation document that you mentioned, that was formed during the World Leaders Summit earlier in the week. Do you think that Indigenous communities like narrative was brought through sufficiently in that document? And can you tell us a bit more about what maybe you'd like to see as that builds?
I mean, I think, again, it's a step forward because the document did refer to Indigenous peoples. It referred to the importance of protecting Indigenous knowledge and recognize as well that Indigenous peoples are active participants to the climate crisis and not just victims, and the contribution they can give to society in combating the climate crisis. However, similar to the forest tenure donor statement, although it commits sums of money to projects that also include Indigenous peoples, it is not clear how this will work in practice. And unfortunately, it has been criticized by Indigenous communities on the basis that, similar to the statements they have made in the past about other nature-based solutions, such as a lot run by the Red Plus project, it risks handing over more areas of their lands to corporations and to the state, because it fails to recognize that it needs that in order to work properly, it must allow Indigenous lands to remain to Indigenous peoples. It doesn't mention land tenure, it doesn't mention the recognition of Indigenous lands. And therefore, what it could mean in practice is that, yes, nature-based solutions are implemented and deforestation is halted, but this could actually lead to the expropriation of lands from Indigenous peoples and put them at the risk of hunger, undermine their culture and traditions, because losing access over their own lands means undermining millennia and centuries of tradition that are important to their everyday life, and could again give us a bit the impression that we're making a lot of progress, but we're only making progress in one direction. Certainly, we need to end deforestation. And interestingly enough, we made a pledge in 2014 about ending deforestation by 2030. We're remaking the same pledge now. We'll see if we make any progress since we didn't 7 years ago. But yes, it's a big step. But again, it mentions Indigenous peoples as part of the solution, but it fails to, I think, go to the heart of the problems that Indigenous peoples face and to the actual solutions that are needed for these problems, such as recognition of Indigenous lands, recognition of Indigenous tenure, and opens the door to more problems because it doesn't treat these issues with the seriousness that they have. And again, it talks about Indigenous peoples, but when it was discussed, I think you can tell it didn't allow them to be part of the discussion and to make their voices heard. It's a significant step forward because it puts Indigenous peoples at the forefront of something that is so important, such as deforestation, but it doesn't allow them to express their own view as to how this should be solved in practice. And I'm hoping, therefore, that it will happen in practice, it will materialize, that the money does go to Indigenous communities, that the deforestation pledges don't lead to further expropriation. But I think we're going to have to wait for the next 2 or 3 COPs to see if this has happened and if it has been a step forward for them and not just for us in terms of deforestation.
So thinking, I guess, a little bit shorter term, what are your hopes for the next week at COP? And what do you hope to see outcomes at the end of next week?
So I think there is hope for better outcomes. I think there will be significant references to Indigenous communities. I think, as Chiara mentioned, in relation to things such as adaptation, I think the gender discussions will be very relevant to Indigenous peoples, because that's one thing that we didn't see this far. When they were talking about Indigenous peoples, there wasn't a lot of discussion about how women within Indigenous communities are actually the biggest victims of the climate crisis. And I think the Gender Day will allow for this to come forward and will bring minority issues to the table once more, because by addressing gender exclusion, etc., it will raise issues of exclusion in general and of the importance not only of the adoption of a gender perspective, but also an Indigenous perspective in climate. So I think that will be a day where we'll see some progress and we'll see a lot of references to Indigenous communities. I think the Nature Day will give the option and the possibility for Indigenous peoples to have their voices heard, because they are those who hold the keys to nature and who understand nature better than anyone else. So I think progress has been made. I don't think COP has been a flop in terms of Indigenous peoples. I think where it has failed is to actually include them, as we've seen from the UN Special Rapporteur's criticism and the fact that they've been left out of the rooms. But at least in terms of recognition of their rights and of their role in the climate crisis, some progress has been made, but there is a long, long, long way to go. So by the end of next week, I hope we'll see a few more statements on Indigenous peoples and on the protection of minority rights and minority knowledge.
Great. I also hold out my hope to see those coming through in the next few days. Thank you very much for joining me and discussing that. It's a shame Alison couldn't join us, but obviously Article 6 is hopefully gaining some traction and some decisions being made there. So I hope, fingers crossed for that. We'll try and reach out to Alison and get some comments from Alison for everyone watching, so they can find out a little bit more from her work too. Thanks to everyone for coming along again today. We will be having a break tomorrow and back again for our next live session on Monday at midday. So please do join us then. And again, a huge thank you for everyone that has tracked our 2 topics today, Virginia and Chiara, and for Prem also joining us today. Thanks very much, everyone.